Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Madie Riley. I am the communications director here at Boostlingo. Today, I am joined by Sergio Llorian, who is our president of EMEA and RSI. And he is also a member of the board that chose the ISO standards for ISO 24019. So he's going to be a great resource for us today. And with me, I also have Katharine Allen. Katharine was actually a founding instructor at the Glendon College Masters in Conference Interpreting at York University in Canada, and she taught there for 8 years. Is that right?
Yep,
Yeah,
I did. Yep,
awesome,
first 8 years of the program.
wonderful. So they are joining me today. They're going to be great resources for us. Really excited about it. Thank you guys for hopping in. I'm going to take 1 second just to make sure that we're connecting live. Okay, awesome. So let's jump right in. Sergio, what is ISO and why do we have standards like this?
Well, really, basically, ISO is just a series of international standards. These are standards that take aim, and they could be, I mean, they address a range of different subjects, materials, etc. And the purpose of it is to create some degree of standardization or expectant level. Therefore, certification to a specific standard is something that a buyer or an interested party might require of a partner, someone with whom they affiliate. So these international standards boards take experts in specific fields and create these standards. Uh, and it's you're not mandated to adhere, but it creates a commercially advantageous situation when you comply and when you can be certified for these specific standards.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's like a guidepost that everybody knows, like, okay, if you have this, I know that at least you've met these minimum requirements. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and
And they do it for security as well, right? Like there's ISO standards are not just in they're in all of the realms.
in all of the realms. I mean, name
Yeah.
the realm, they're there. Security is a major one because especially when we talk about communications like what we're doing right now, people, security, privacy, all of these things are considered, and there are a lot of standards around that front. And standards are also they refer to each other. So you might have for example, in 2419, which we're going to be discussing today, they also refer to security standards that you want to meet as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes
But just
sense.
but just to give an example, if it's still a fuzzy concept, I think one of the best ISO approved items I ever bought was an ISO approved suitcase that had met all of the specifications for the fabrication and manufacturing of that suitcase. So I mean, it took me a while to understand that these ISO standards apply to just about anything, products and services and processes around the world, and interpretation is no different. We have our own set and series of standards that help provide a baseline for what is quality in our profession.
Yeah, it,
That
pr-
makes
it
sense.
provides it provides a baseline. It's really
Yeah.
good. If you want to be acknowledged as meeting these standards, then be certified within this standard.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I so this is kind of a question that I think is interesting. I've been in the US my whole life and have never really traveled abroad. ISO is not really on my radar, but from what you guys have been saying, I guess maybe ISO is more of a knowledge base inside of Europe.
No, I don't think I'd say that. The whole idea of the international standards is that the standards are international, and in fact, as we were collaborating on, I mean, as we were collaborating on this standard itself, there were representatives that come from basically every country will have their board of experts in a specific subject matter, and they're the ones representing that area. So. No, I don't know if I would say that that's correct. Um, Certainly, my experience is more European, but that's all.
I think where it's correct is that I think there would maybe a broader awareness among the interpreting profession inside Europe, especially interpreters who are, trained up as conference interpreters more than anything in Europe, have
Mm,
more awareness as practitioners of the ISO standards. And I would say in the United States, we're still gaining awareness as practitioners. certainly many language service companies are very aware of ISO and do what they can to become certified within the different standards that are set. But I do think that there's less awareness, which is one of the reasons why we're doing this. For the US based audience, a lot of interpreters are not aware that there are standards that help govern and guide what quality is and what our behavior and conduct should be around that.
Do you know?
Yeah.
I'll go ahead. I'll go ahead and qualify what I said before. I totally backpack on what, or piggyback on what Catherine was saying, which is to say, within this subject matter, she's 100% right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In general, when we talk about international standards on like suitcases or whatever whatever else there might be, no, I don't know if it's regionally specific, but it is true when we talk about the familiarity with standards insofar as they relate to language services and interpretation in general. I would say, comfort or at least familiarity is more prevalent here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. Well, and Sergio, you were on the board. Tell us about how that happened and what was it like to be a part of that process? Give us a little peek behind the curtain.
Oh, a little peek, because it was a long multi-year process. But I basically was in communication with someone who was serving on the board, and she just encouraged me. She said, if you're not on this, you should be. So I applied to Danish Standard, and joined on as an expert. Having been a lawyer and a native English speaker, it actually put me in a position during the drafting process to kind of roll up my sleeves and get into some of the language. So I'm familiar sufficiently with the technology, and that I was able to actually use some other skills, hopefully for the betterment of the document in total. But then several years and one pandemic later, a lot of video meetings. The draft took a lot of turns, as it always does. You get influences from all sorts, and it becomes it can be really challenging, but it's meant to be and very collaborative, where you listen to all voices to come up with standards that actually make sense within a context.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting that your background as a lawyer helped there, just because are most of the people who are in these groups, what kind of professionals are they?
Well, so when you're meant to be an industry expert, so
Okay.
since we're talking about here simultaneous interpretation delivery, uh, all of the experts represent hardware or software or interpretation in general. Language services, perhaps more generally as well. So there are a lot of different industry experts that are expert from a specific angle. I
Okay.
only mentioned my legal background because when it came time to finesse the words, when we take an amorphous concept and we want to put it into a sentence, then suddenly it's like, okay, well, you tap into some past histories to help you out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, Catherine, I want you to set the stage for us about, why we care about these standards, why we're talking about them as an industry. Like, what has been happening that this has become a hot topic? Because I think ISO standards generally wouldn't make it to the surface of
Make it through,
things that are
except for those
interesting.
of us, who are really embedded.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start, and then I think Sergio should definitely, follow what I would say. But certainly, we're talking about a standard for simultaneous interpreting delivery platforms, and with the pandemic, you had a profession that went from mostly on-site delivery, despite the big remote interpreting market, still the majority of interpreting was delivered on site, to, in the space of 2-3 weeks, the entire communication had to go, virtual, as we all know, whether you're involved in interpreting or not. So suddenly,
Mhm.
all interpreters, whether they had previously rejected any kind of remote interpreting or not, if you didn't interpret remotely, you didn't interpret. You didn't have work.
Hmm.
So this development of sort of the platforms and the sound issues and how to deliver really good sound to the interpreters and make sure everybody could hear each other, suddenly that just became really, really important for everyone. And on the interpreting side, what I think many people don't realize is when you are interpreting simultaneously, you are listening to the speaker and you're also listening to your own voice because you're interpreting at the same time. And so the sound has to be impeccable. It has to be much better than it is for the person speaking or the person who's just listening. And so interpreters have their headsets on, they're taking that input in right directly in, and there turned out to be a lot of sound problems from poor sound, poor headsets, no headsets, headsets that would produce sudden, bursts of loud noises. And so we ran into a lot of issues of health. It ultimately led to quite a few health problems for some interpreters who were having to struggle to work 5 or 6 hours a day. Imagine running a marathon in, I don't know, high heels or flip flops. It was kind of like that. Like if you're an interpreter and you're trying to deal with poor sound, and all of the concentration it takes to do that really difficult simultaneous interpreting, it all starts to cascade, and so you see a lot of health issues even for interpreters. So that's part of what's, certainly on the interpreting side and the practitioner side, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of discussion around sound. Suddenly we all became, what's the best headset and what's my best setting and should I get a mixing board? And none of us who were tech people, we suddenly had to pay a lot of attention to technology. So I'll kind of leave it there, but that's one of the reasons why it's so prevalent. And I'll let you talk about the news headlines, Sergio, if you want, that we've had recently in Europe that are related to this.
But I think as a point of departure, Katharine, what you say is correct. It's really important for interpreters to have these standards, but I also want to look at it from another angle of why it's so important for the technologies to have these standards as well. When we think in general about the advent of new technologies, and with the pandemic, all of these simultaneous interpretation delivery platforms had a moment to really advance technologically. It's very interesting, of course, but it's also very dangerous. If technology, it's tough to get the genie back in the bottle when you start making technological advances. At the same time, when you advance without guideposts, when you advance without the standards that say, you're losing sight of what our end goal is. Our end goal as a technology is the delivery of simultaneous interpretation. That simultaneous interpretation is powered by professionals. If therefore the technology is not appropriate for the professionals to do their jobs with some degree of standard, with some degree of protection, with some degree of security, then we are not succeeding in our jobs. And that therefore it's what Katharine says is 100% correct. But it very much is not an us versus them. This is what they require of us, and this is what we have to produce. It is in our interest to serve interpreters. It's in our interest to make sure that they are treated professionally, that their health is considered, that their security and privacy is considered. We look at this from every angle, because that is part of the holistic service that we are delivering together. And so, truly, when new technologies advance, what Katharine was alluding to, there were protests, there were strikes, there were challenges faced when the reliance on remote technologies became too prevalent, where there were considerations on whether it was sufficiently professional or even physically safe to continue in these ways. The timing, therefore, of the publication of this specific standard, it was really interesting, because it's saying this is the expectation that we as an industry have, so that an interpreter can feel, I don't know, Katharine, how would you put it, reassured that we are actually looking out for their interests, and looking, that our interests are first of all aligned, and that we are looking out for them together. So it's the timing of it, I think, was an interesting one.
Yeah, you guys have been working on this for years, right? So it was just coincidentally part of the conversation as these protests happened. And we even saw an article yesterday where an interpreter was taken out because of an injury. And actually, Katharine, I'd like for you to explain what an injury from
Oh boy,
simultaneous interpreting
I'm
could
gonna
be.
I'm gonna explain it in really layman's terms. So I'm gonna
Please
put that
do.
caveat here, because you can, some of the issues that interpreters are dealing with have a lot to do with how poor sound impacts our hearing and our health. And I'm not a medical provider, and I pour through these articles because I think it's also fairly misunderstood. And I see huge sort of raging debates about exactly what's happening when interpreters get injuries. But for the interpreter that was in the news yesterday, they experienced a loud burst of sound directly into their headset, and it led them to get dizzy. I mean, I can't remember what the exact symptoms were, but they passed out, or they got dizzy, or they got, they had a very severe, their brain couldn't handle that loud static burst of sound, and it impacted them so much that they were incapacitated. And there have been quite a few studies actually done with, especially with the interpreters that are working simultaneously in the Canadian Parliament, in the EU, and the UN, places where it's a daily job. You're doing it 5, 6, 7 hours at a time, which is not necessarily what a freelance interpreter would be doing every day. And those interpreters have had significant impacts and complain of migraines, dizziness, headaches, fatigue, like sort of these ongoing symptoms that really impact their health if they're overexposed. And I think I wanted to sort of piggyback a little bit as well on what Sergio was saying. It's like, it's definitely a partnership. It's a partnership with the technology and the interpreters and the event organizers and speakers, right? So, and one of the biggest conundrums we have in our profession is that a smooth interpreted event is one in which the interpreters are actually fairly invisible, right? You hear the sound, you hear the interpretation, you don't see them, but they magically produce this rendition of whatever the speaker's saying into all these different languages. And of course, it's not magic, but that is that idea that's when you're, in some ways, when the interpreter is working, is actually when the whole goal is to kind of have them be least visible, so that person who's
Feels seamless.
speaking is the one who's highlighted, right? It's their words. It's, we're doing our absolute best to make them sound as good as they possibly can. But speakers, of course, they're worried about their speech, what they're talking about, how they log on, can they handle this technology here and there, and it's not in their brain like, oh, I really need to have this headset or this mic, which I actually don't want to wear. That, it's like, right? It's been, that partnership is still, I think, in construction. Like that partnership with the speakers, where, hey, we really need you to follow the guidelines, and that's part of what the EU Parliament interpreter, the interpreters who struck at the European Union, was that they're really trying to force speakers to their end of the partnership. You can't call in with earbuds. You can't call in with no mic. So that's part of it's kind of a conundrum, because as interpreters, we're relying on individuals who have a lot of other things going on in their brain than the interpreters needs to actually take it into account, that invisible voices needs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. And I like that you mentioned that we're still in construction here, because as you've told me, simultaneous interpreting, conference interpreting, it's a really young profession, right? And remote simultaneous, especially young. Can you give us a little bit of background on like what the history is, how long this has been around, and why we're still kind of in the walking phases, not running phases?
Who do you want to take that question?
Catherine, take
Yeah,
it.
you all start. Well, again, I'm going to start, and then Sergio, I'll start and bring us up to the platform arena, and then you can finish. It's mostly just when we think about interpreting, it is as a modern profession. Of course, as an activity, it's as millennials old, but as a modern profession, we often talk about interpreting as having really taken shape during, in the aftermath of World War II and with the Nuremberg trials, especially when we're talking about simultaneous interpreting. But what I think is interesting is that simultaneous interpreting has always required technology, because you always have to separate the one voice from the other, so that the French speaker can listen to the interpreter and also have some interaction with the speaker. And so those technologies got their start in the 1920s, right? They were bubbling along for quite a long time, and then the Nuremberg trials really, just like the pandemic, leapfrog, forced the simultaneous platforms to leapfrog. The Nuremberg trials was when, oh God, we can't do this consecutively. We can't have someone speak, pause. We have to bring in this newfangled thing called simultaneous. And the pushback against it that time was just as strong as RSI, as remote interpreting. The pushback to remote interpreting. So simultaneous, it's a young profession. We're not even 100 years old. and the technology has been developing apace with sort of how technology has been developing in other areas, and then we come to the point where we had these fairly new remote simultaneous platform, dedicated video conference, meeting conference platforms that were in development, and then the pandemic provided this just big accelerator. So Sergio, why don't you take it from there?
I mean,
Thanks,
well,
yeah.
I think you've encapsulated it perfectly. That's exactly right. And I think, to highlight something that you said that's really interesting is that, the pushback that we discussed that we're experiencing now against remote interpretation, the same pushback was experienced back in the 40s and 50s when these were up and coming. Every time there's a new technology and people have to work in a different way, there's resistance. It's psychological, but it's also practical.
Right.
It is practical in a lot of ways, and that's specifically what these. There are standards that relate to the hardware and the equipment, the technology that was used back then, as it continues to evolve. And so these standards really go to address specifically that. So with we talk about the proliferation of online communication in general, and throughout the pandemic, taking aside interpretation as an experience, uh, everyone dealt with video conferencing fatigue. Our posture
Right.
suffered. Our eyes
What do you
suffered.
mean, Sergio?
Yeah, I was like,
What are you talking about, Sergio? I sit like this all of the time. Definitely not when somebody mentions it.
yeah. But yeah, but we all dealt with it on a micro level, and then when you extrapolate it to what interpreters experience when they do this, and they have to also do what is exceptionally cognitively taxing, which is simultaneous interpretation, you can just see how the effects get magnified, in that way. Uh, so and that's just not only a sign of the technology of where we are in the evolution of technology and how we deliver language services in general, but also uh, a sign of the times of what we've just been through as a as a planet. So that gets us to where we are now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that if we're thinking about technology entering, interpreting, that seems like a new topic, but the idea of two audio feeds, 80 years ago, that is wild. And this couldn't exist without them, right? And so the technology came and transformed the way that we performed this, profession. And then now we're doing it again. And I think that that's just like a really interesting segue into how we're building these partnerships, right? Because, like you said, Sergio, part of it is practical. The resistance is practical, right? And sometimes the technology steps in front of the needs of the people who are going to use it, right? And I think some of this standardization is a way for us to correct maybe some of the things we overlooked whenever we started building out the idea of remote simultaneous interpretation, right? We definitely said, okay, we can do this. And now we're saying, okay, how can we partner with the speakers, with the platform, and with the interpreters to make this into something that works for all of us for the long term? And Sergio, I'd love for you to kind of touch on how the standards go about sharing that burden of good quality events that keep everybody safe, um, between the platform and the speakers and the interpreters. Maybe touch on what is expected out of the platform and what is expected for the platform to tell the speakers and that kind of
Yeah.
angle.
I mean, I think when we think about an overview, I wanna bring back something Catherine said a little earlier, which is, it's that partnership that you have, and I view it as like this lovely little dance where what Catherine says is true, and it's so illogical at the same time that users, speakers in these moments don't think about the interpreter's experience, yet it's so illogical that they don't think about the interpreter's experience because they are consumers ostensibly
Hmm.
of this interpretation. They need the interpretation to be as good as possible. They therefore need the audio that they're putting into that interpretation ecosystem to be fantastic, so that the audio that they get out of that interpretation ecosystem is fantastic. And when I say audio, I actually don't only mean audio, because one of the really interesting aspects of this standard is that it applies not only to spoken simultaneous interpretation, but signed as well. So when we talk about users, we don't just mean speakers, we mean signers as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so but it's such an interesting thing, and it really is at the crux of Madie, your question, and what Katharine was saying before, which is, the relationship that became and has always been quite obvious to me, but became really, really prominent. The relationship between the technologies and the interpreters are at the heart of this. But when you exclude the users, the consumers, the participants in these types of events, from that conversation, you're destroying the whole delicate dance immediately. And so these standards actually address it, as a three-party responsibility. And that actually became a topic that was quite challenging to get through, because it's, how do you take responsibility as a platform over someone's actions if you have no control over them? And that's something that's it's something that's that remains really difficult. But so there are responsibilities on the users, responsibilities on the technology, and responsibilities on the interpreter. There is a responsibility on the technology provider themselves to inform the users and to inform the interpreters, not only of what their responsibilities are, but also if someone's not complying, to make sure that there's information there so that people are aware of what they are experiencing or what they expect to be experiencing. Um, again, these are problems that we might not necessarily have any control over fixing if it's outside of our control. However, we have a lot of control over informing, and that's really important, because that communication also allows the interpreters to understand what's happening, and to protect themselves in that way as well.
Yeah, and I want to dig into, the informing and how do you go about enforcing. And so we'll circle back to that. But Catherine, I would like for you to take this from the interpreter perspective, right? We are correcting to help interpreters be safer and to have a better experience on remote simultaneous interpreting, but there's still a burden on interpreters as well to make sure that they have what they need to be successful. And what does that look like to you? What do you think that these standards set about for interpreters that's they need to be responsible for?
Well, the equipment to begin with. I mean, everybody, right? So the platform is one thing, but just as Sergio said, the platform can't control if the interpreter has technology new enough, to be able to receive sound and transmit sound. If you have a headset that's going to, be compliant with that, and I'm going to let Sergio talk about that in a minute. So on our end, first and foremost, we really need to have the technological setup to be a remote interpreter, and has been a huge new burden and also challenge for many interpreters. I mean, I think in the interpreting profession in general, especially at the level where you're doing remote simultaneous, especially in the conference arena, it's not a young profession. Like typically, you've been in the profession for a couple decades at least, till you get to the point where you have that seasoned expertise. So you're struggling with like a new technology, more new technology, more new technology. You're talking, and it's that can be challenging. So I think that's one of the first responsibilities. And in terms of informing, the better we can get at empowering and enabling interpreters to just understand, here is the minimum of what you need to be able to do this at an acceptable standard for the people listening to you, and also for your own health, right? So you definitely have to take responsibility there. You can't be an interpreter coming in with earbuds and or just not paying attention to those things. And it's a steep learning curve. So for me, I've spent the last decade before the pandemic trying to help people with that adoption of technology and that learning curve, right? It's hard and it's ongoing. And then I'd say the other part is to be collaborative. Is to, I mean, we have to be, we have this weird profession where we're invisible in the actual act of our profession. When we're actually exercising interpretation, we want to be very, very unseen because we want to be someone else's voice. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be advocating for our needs outside of that. We need the materials. We need the platform to be giving us, are you giving us the tech checks? Are you working with the speaker? Are you connecting us so that we can say what our needs are around this? Are you giving us protocols and avenues to alert people the sound is bad, I need to turn off my mic? I mean, all of those things are still conversations that I think we can really help by providing best practices and even scripts for people to and to creating expectation from the speakers. Oh, if I'm doing something that's interpreted, I think this is where we most fail. Like the speaker is focusing on, like we were today, we prepped to speak. If we were being interpreted, then it should be on us to think about, did we give them our notes? Are we going to speak in such a way that's actually going to be easier to interpret? Are we going to take responsibility for our communication needing to be put out into a big multilingual arena, right? So it's just a lot of collaboration there. So I'll stop there. Sorry. Go on.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really interesting because in my head, what I'm thinking is, there's not a checklist that exists right now for a conference interpreter to sit down and make sure they have this, and this. And I think as an industry, like part of these standards is us basically developing like the checklist of
That
what you
kind of
need to
is
be
now, yeah,
successful.
exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
one of our other things that Boostlingo has been involved with, we have 3 authors on the upcoming The Remote Interpreter textbook. So there is a forthcoming textbook next year, and it does have those checklists. So stay
Oh, really?
tuned.
Excited for
Yeah,
that. Really excited
That's
for that.
yeah,
wonderful.
yeah.
Is
So
there a section on simultaneous interpreting or
there's a huge,
simultaneous?
there's going to be 2 chapters on RSI and a third on conference interpreting. So it's going to cover OPI, VRI, but it also it does a pretty big deep dive into this end. So not to but just to say it's forthcoming. We're super excited that at least we'll have some models forthcoming.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that's great. I mean, any time that you can educate somebody about how to be an advocate for themselves, how they can be successful, right? Especially
yeah,
because most conference interpreters are freelancers, right? And so giving them what they need to be able to talk to their employer, which is
right.
usually the provider or the event organizer, in a way where, they can both stand up for themselves and come across as like a good contractor and somebody who's responsible and wants this event to go well, I think is really interesting.
Do you
And
know?
go ahead.
I think that's super well put, Maddie. Because I think when Catherine talks about the burden and the challenges that were placed on interpreters, in the sudden shift during the pandemic, I think that's correct. And it also kind of, as you're highlighting here, created an opportunity for interpreters to educate themselves on what are best practices, what is the best equipment, to take control of their own health, of their own professional output, and to take an active role in that. It's not too dissimilar to when we talk about going back to duty to inform and to provide information to help people out. It's like a doctor and a patient. The doctor can make the prescription, but the patient has to take the medicine.
Yep.
That's like that relationship that we have. We want to make sure. And I really like the term collaboration, you know, and not a 2-party collaboration, but a 3-party
Yeah.
collaboration.
Hmm.
We all have an interest in the quality of the interpretation being as good as possible. And I've always said that my personal philosophy in building BoostEvents technology was empowering interpreters to work at the height of their professional abilities. That's really what we want. It is. It makes the technology look good. Of course, it makes the interpreter shine as invisible as they want to be. The more invisible they are, the more they shine in that context. And also make sure that the users are having the experience that they wanted, the experience that they needed. The whole reason why you bring in interpretation services is to break down language barriers, is to make sure that everyone is understood, is to make sure that events are accessible and inclusive for everyone involved. If you actually want to exercise that, if you actually want to practice those values, and make sure that people have access to the information that you're trying to convey, it begins with providing good audio. It continues with having a good experience for the interpreters, and it ends with the interpreter being able to deliver on their own expertise in an effective and professional way.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting so we have the dynamic where the interpreter is a freelancer usually that's hired by the person who is running the event, right? So you have that employee employer relationship, but then you also have the speaker, and the speaker is usually the one that is paying for the services, right? And so in a consumer mindset, we want to make it as easy as possible on the speaker, right? And so the tendency sometimes is to put the burden as much as we can onto the platform and onto the interpreter, right? And so turning the tables to where we don't focus mostly on the easy, but we focus on the transparent, right? Where we have really great reasons for everything that we ask of the speakers, right? We're including them in the conversation, and so that they don't seem like weird mandates that, I'm paying
Right.
you, why are you asking so much out of me? um, if we can help them to understand, like, okay, this is why we do this, and this is how you're going to be successful from the very beginning. We tell you exactly what we need out of you, and having that as part of the discovery calls, I think, is a really great way to include them in the process. And I'd love to hear what else you have to say there, Sergio.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point. One of the overlooked elements of that, though, is that the purchaser of these types of services is very infrequently the consumer of the
Yeah.
services. So you have the speaker or the signer, the communicator, in any event. Um, they're quite comfortable communicating in their preferred language, but the person who's trying to access that information, who's trying to get that message, is not the person that necessarily engaged the service.
Yeah.
So there's an educational and like an empathetic hurdle there to say to the speaker, even though you're not the person that's benefiting from you providing good audio or speaking at a reasonable
Hmm.
pace, or being fully visible, on camera, even though you're not the one that's benefiting from what you're inputting, the success of your overall event and all your stakeholders involved are the ones that are benefiting. We can't look at this. I think when we talk about where the burden is, the predominantly the burden should be on the platform, because the platform is the piece that's bringing all of this and putting it together, bringing
Hmm.
in the interpreters. You serve the interpreters, you serve the users, you make sure that it all comes together. However, it is still a collaboration, and there is an educational element, because unfortunately very often the purchaser is not actually the consumer of what it is that we're ultimately trying to deliver here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a follow-up. Can I, Madie? I know I'm not moderating, but just
Go for
to
it.
to Sergio, I wanted to ask, because I think, just to get back to the standards,
Sure.
we've focused a lot on kind of the sound aspect of it, but I
Yeah.
think that the standard goes way beyond that, because the difference between having remote, using the Zoom feature for remote simultaneous or the WebEx feature for remote simultaneous, is that the RSI platform is designed to have a good experience for the speaker, an easy experience for the multilingual user, right, who has to click on channels and find their interpretation, and be able to engage multilingually, and then and also an inside the platform ability for teams of interpreters to work together seamlessly, which requires lots of buttons and controls and being able to communicate on the back end that the front end doesn't see. Like, that's what's built into a remote simultaneous platform that's not built in. I mean, it's partially built into the big commercial ones. And so I wanted to ask you, Sergio, to speak to that, because it's I'm not as technical as you are, obviously, and I'm still coming. I don't have the same breadth of knowledge of the standard, but my understanding is it's all of that that's included in the standard. Is that it's the delivery is not just about sound.
I mean, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah. That's super well put, and it is not just about sound. There's a lot that goes into it, and it's a really important distinction, because there are many ways to communicate online, and there's a huge gulf between communicating in an environment that is built for that specific purpose, for that specific configuration, and one that is built for a different purpose, but this specific configuration is shoehorned in. There's a whole breadth of it, and that's where these standards really go a long way. They're saying if you are actually looking for this experience, if you are actually trying to make your event accessible and inclusive, if you're actually trying to break down language barriers, then having technology that's built for purpose and that is meeting certain industry standards of exactly how we accomplish that purpose is essential. This is where you
Mhm.
start. If you're just paying lip service and wanting to tick a box, well, then there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. I mean, you know, just send a note via bird.
Yep.
There's a lot of different things that you can do. But no, having the difference. I mean, Catherine, you're hitting on a really important point. The gulf of difference between platforms that you can use and platforms that you should use. They it's a big gulf, and it's an expanding one. And when we talk about the collaboration um, among the users, the participants and the interpreters and the technology, that collaboration is what's supported by these standards,
Right.
and that's in industry. That's within our industry. Those are the conversations that we have, and as we advocate for all of our stakeholders, not just our customers, but our interpreters as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And we've, I mean, in a reasonable way, we focused a lot kind of on the conference interpreting side and that elite area, I guess, of our profession. But part of what certainly is so exciting to me about the platform integration, right, that we've got going with the Boostlingo world is that brings an integrated, dedicated ISO standard platform over into the possibility for now school districts and local governments and hospitals to provide interpreters who have way less support professionally than conference interpreters do to begin with. They have much less access to the ability to really, advocate for themselves. I mean, the conversations there are so much younger, and there's so much newer, and the lack of understanding around, why that. I'll just give an example. It's common practice inside many school districts that one interpreter will interpret for 3 or 4 hours at a time simultaneously for public meetings, and it's not out of ill intent. It's out of just sheer ignorance that, hey,
Mhm.
the human brain can't do that, right? So
Mhm.
so to me, as we, because of course this is my part of the world more, it's so I'm so excited. I've worked in all of those hacked conditions, Sergio. I mean, all through the pandemic.
It's like
I worked,
heartbreaking to hear.
yeah, I
Yeah.
worked. I wouldn't work 4 hours alone, but I worked on Zoom. I worked with back channels. I worked with like 3 or 4 devices connected at a time to try and stay connected to my partner. I did a whole bunch of IT support, of which I have very little knowledge or experience. Trying to help people navigate through all of that, the school districts or the local government with the COVID, the public health department doing, oh, wait, we have to wait. How do we do this? Everybody was talk about deer in headlights. So these standards to me are really exciting for what they can portend if we can get the education, if we can really push that education and collaborative piece, and that, the awareness needs to be raised across not just the conference world, but the whole big interpreting market, because RSI is happening everywhere, not just at, at the European Union. So
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's such an interesting avenue, to elevate the industry broadly in having technologies that are fit for purpose that suddenly are because we're not only talking about language services that make something accessible, but technologies that also make jobs easier to perform, or
right,
communications a little more seamless. So it's an interesting time that we've been able to leverage the tragedy of a pandemic to now have technologies that enable us to do so much more than what we've done in the past. But the standards have to be there to make sure that we're
yeah,
not just doing it, but doing it right.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and I think that for me, the market education piece is obviously where I come in, and something that I am excited about is the idea that this is new territory, right? And so people are interested in it. They want to know how it works. And I think if we can get to a place where accessibility is not an afterthought because we make it so transparent for people and we make it so, easy for them to find and to understand, that's a huge win for me because, like you said, Catherine, we're bringing RSI and higher standards into these spaces where the interpretation maybe didn't even exist before, right? If it's a rural area, or we're bringing it higher standard of interpretation into maybe places where things were kind of hacked around before, right? And I think that's really exciting. And if we have these standards, it's a way for us to leverage the market and say like, hey, these exist, and also these RSI platforms exist, and actually they are better for you and better for the interpreters, right? And so if we can get to people before they choose their platform, right, rather than 3 months into planning and they're like, hey, we need an interpreter, can you somehow shoehorn us in here, right? That would be a major win. And so for us and the consumer, right, because it's on par affordability wise. You're going to get a better quality, and also the interpreters are going to want to keep coming back. And also the best interpreters are on these platforms because they know that they're better for them in the long run. And so expanding the access to that workforce is really exciting, putting them in places like school districts and city council meetings. That's great for me. That's an exciting win on this. Awesome. Well, I think that brings us kind of to the end of our talking points that we wanted to go through today. But are there any final words you guys have that you want to put in on this topic?
Yeah, it's just to make sure that everyone knows that when it comes to these resources and when it comes to information like hardware or other tips that'll help that collaboration among the parties involved in these types of events, that the Boostlingo website is always evolving, and we provide resources there to make sure that people stay informed, and so hopefully that's a resource that our audience here today can leverage as well.
And we tease that I think we're going to have a pretty robust resource around headset guidance.
Yes, we can consider it teased.
Consider it teased.
Consider it teased. Yeah. So
yeah, and once you see that, you pick your headset, if you're at the standard level, then you can do anything, right? You'll be over prepared for all of your other events, and then you'll be eligible to take the events like the UN or something along that line, where they're going to definitely want to adhere to these standards, right? So you're setting yourself up for success in the long run.
Yeah, and hopefully better acoustic health.
Always.
Yes.
Acoustic health. You learn a new term every day in this profession. I am going to be thinking about my acoustic health for days to come. So awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody else for joining our stream today. I hope that you learned some things, and we'd love to hear from you. So comment on LinkedIn or send us an email. We'd love to chat with you.
Thanks, everyone.
Great.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye. Thank you so much, Madie. Thanks, Sergio.
Thanks.
Bye, Katharine.
Bye-bye.